This is about the author Russell Banks, travel, love, and marriage. I selected a book off the shelf at the library solely because of its title, Voyager, Travel Writings. I chose it because I am not one, a voyager. There is nothing wrong with consulting your opposite in the ongoing quest for new or unusual information, an alternate perspective. The book was written by Russell Banks, a very successful novelist with many critically acclaimed books to his credit, some of which have become movies. There came a time a while back when I felt obligated to read something by Russell Banks, so I got hold of one of his novels and I read it. I've said before that I don't read much fiction, so I might well be a poor judge of it, but in any event, my memory tells me I didn't like the book, and since it was a big, long one, there was an awful lot of it for me not to like. Banks is a traveling enthusiast. He even very intimately, metaphorically and literally, identifies with the spacecraft Voyager. I did like his travel book. The first part of it is a long essay on traveling extensively in the Caribbean, where I have not been, with a woman he is about to marry. It begins, a man who has been married 4 times has a lot of explaining to do. Truly, this is the beginning and end, the sum and substance, the be-all and end-all of what he has to say. It's also rather odd because, as I have just read elsewhere, a storyteller doesn't have to explain anything. The story speaks for itself. If that's true, as I think it is, that makes this an offbeat book, one at odds with itself, a story stuffed full of explanations. There is a lot of travel in that first piece, and even more explaining. It is a memoir, a travelogue, a history, a mystery, and a confessional. Banks is a very reflective man, and a lot of the time he's looking into the mirror of himself, seeking himself, who he was at 20, 30, 50, 70. He lived in the Caribbean for years with his second wife and their 3 children, and that past life haunts his current trip through much of the same territory. Many times that territory has not changed, but he has. He says he's dealing with dual and dueling fantasies. One is what he calls the atavistic neocolonial racial fantasy. That is the unbridgeable chasm between the chic Rastafarian descendant of slavery and the mostly clueless, curious white American tourists. In the Caribbean, he writes, there is not much distance between the height of ecstasy and the slough of despond. It is the constant contrast between the overabundant physical beauty of sea and sand and sky and the grinding poverty of most of the people who live out their lives there. The second fantasy is love and marriage, something he was working on for most of his life. And the two are intertwined. By this time in our journey, he writes, I could see clearly that my courtship narrative and this peripatetic voyage through the archipelago ran parallel to each other in ways both exculpatory and condemning, the one reflecting, enabling, and explicating the other. I just read a book by a man, Ian Fraser, who identified himself as a romantic. Banks is a romantic too. He loves nature, especially when she is raw, wild, and picturesque, also free from the disgorging hordes the package tours. And he loves women enough to marry 4 of them. He likes to explain things or to see that things have an explanation, whether it is the formation of a volcano, an ancient myth, or a divorce. The explanations can get pretty turgid. Here's one. In marrying each other, we were, for different reasons, abandoning each other, both of us sentenced to unexpected solitude, She, by virtue of the end of the long, ongoing drama of our romance, which until then had kept her such good company, and I, by virtue of her relentless need to appropriate and objectify my subjective life, a direct consequence of her inability to perceive the autonomous existence, never mind the essence, of another person's inner reality. Like I said, it gets a bit thick. The last few pieces in the book see Banks off on mountain climbing expeditions, seeking to test his limitations and to counter the effects of aging. He explains all of that, too. That's okay, but not personally relevant. I have a tough time with the stairs, so I don't need the 18,000-foot high passes and peaks. It reminded me of the macho Hemingway, his fascination with the boxing and the bullfighting. Fine for them, have at it, but not for me.